Number 1. Stephen Paddock. On the night of October 1st, 2017, thousands of people were standing on an open field on the Las Vegas Strip, listening to country music under a warm desert sky. Nobody in that crowd had any reason to look up at the Mandalay Bay Hotel towering above them. But high up on the 32nd floor, in 2 connected suites, a 64-year-old man named Stephen Craig Paddock had spent days quietly building what would become the deadliest mass shooting carried out by a lone gunman in American history. Paddock was born on April 9, 1953, in Clinton, Iowa, the oldest of 4 sons born to Benjamin Paddock and Dolores Hudson. His father was a bank robber who was arrested when Stephen was only 7 years old, and who later escaped from prison, and ended up on the FBI's most wanted list. His mother told the children their father had died in a car accident, hiding the truth from them for years. The family eventually settled in a low-income neighborhood in Los Angeles, where Dolores worked as a secretary to support her sons. Relatives who knew Stephen growing up described him very differently from the man the world would come to know after the shooting. His brother Patrick said that of all of them, Stephen was the least violent, calling him the most boring one in the family. Former classmates remembered him as a math genius, quiet and withdrawn. Paddock built an ordinary, even successful, adult life. He graduated from California State University, Northridge, with a degree in business administration in 1977. He worked for the Postal Service, then the Internal Revenue Service, and later as an auditor connected to the defense industry, including a stint with a company that eventually merged into Lockheed Martin. He also built a real estate business with his brother Eric, buying and selling properties across Los Angeles and Texas. And by the time he sold off much of that business, relatives estimated he was worth at least $2 million. One of his most profitable investments, an apartment complex bought in 2004, brought him more than $500,000 a year in income by 2011, and records show he made around $6 million when he eventually sold it. He was married and divorced twice, with no children, and stayed on good terms with both ex-wives. For years, he lived a quiet life split between Texas, California, Florida, and eventually a retirement community in Mesquite, Nevada, where he lived with a girlfriend he had met years earlier in Reno. Neighbors describe him as someone who kept to himself and rarely spoke. He was an avid gambler, especially fond of video poker, a game he had played for more than 25 years, usually late at night, since he disliked being out in the sun. Despite his gambling habits, he was not considered a high roller or a whale by Las Vegas casinos, and he was not well known among serious gamblers. He held a pilot's license, owned small planes, and traveled extensively, including 20 cruise trips to places like Spain, Italy, Greece, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates, most of them with his girlfriend by his side. On paper, there was almost nothing that pointed toward violence. His only real brush with law enforcement before the shooting was a minor traffic citation. But in his final months, something in his life began to shift. His girlfriend later said he did not talk much about politics and belonged to no political organizations, but he increasingly complained of feeling sick, was sensitive to chemical smells, often smelled of alcohol in the early mornings, and appeared despondent. He had filled prescriptions for the anti-anxiety medication Valium at several points, the last time just 4 months before the shooting. A local sheriff later said Paddock had been losing a significant amount of wealth since September 2015 and had reportedly gone through bouts of depression. His girlfriend also noticed a decline in his affection toward her, which he blamed on his declining health. Then his gun purchases spiked dramatically. Between October 2016 and late September 2017, Paddock bought more than 55 firearms, mostly rifles, along with a large number of firearm accessories, a sharp increase from the roughly 29 guns he had purchased over the previous 3 decades combined. 2 weeks before the attack, at his suggestion, his girlfriend traveled to her home country, the Philippines, and he wired her $100,000 to buy a house there. During this time, he was seen in Las Vegas with another woman, later confirmed to be uninvolved in the shooting and never named publicly. Just 2 days before the attack, home surveillance footage captured him driving alone to a nearby area to practice shooting. On September 25th, 6 days before the shooting, Paddock checked into the Mandalay Bay with 10 shooting range bags and a computer. 4 days later, he moved into a second connecting suite, so that both rooms overlooked the festival grounds below. On the night of October 1st, Starting at 10:05 p.m., he opened fire from his hotel room onto the crowd attending the Route 91 Harvest Festival, firing more than 1,000 rounds in about 10 minutes. He killed 60 people and wounded roughly 867 others, at least 413 of them by gunfire directly. At some point during the attack, he fired through his own hotel room door, wounding an unarmed security guard named Jesus Campos, who had approached the floor moments earlier on an unrelated matter. Paddock stopped firing at around 10:15 and, investigators believe, took his own life shortly after. Police reached the 32nd floor about 12 minutes after the shooting began, but it took them roughly an hour longer to clear the hallway and confirm it was safe before finally breaching Paddock's door with an explosive charge at 11:20 p.m. Inside, they found 23 rifles and one handgun, many of them fitted with bump stocks, a device that allows a semi-automatic rifle to fire almost as quickly as a fully automatic one. They also found a handwritten note with calculations about distance, elevation, and bullet trajectory, but nothing resembling a confession or an explanation for why he had done it. The investigation that followed was massive. Detectives examined his finances, his computers, his travels, his medical history, and his relationships. They found no evidence that anyone had helped him plan or carry out the attack, and no evidence of ties to any political or religious group. Despite a claim by the Islamic State that Paddock had converted to their cause, a claim American law enforcement found no evidence to support. Ammonium nitrate and a large quantity of tannerite, a binary explosive used for gun-range targets, were found in his car, though investigators said he did not appear to have assembled an actual explosive device from it. Investigators also discovered that his brother, Bruce Paddock, was separately arrested in an unrelated child sexual abuse material investigation, and that hundreds of images of child sexual abuse material were found on Paddock's own laptops. In March of 2023, the FBI released documents suggesting Paddock's motive may have involved resentment over how he and other high-stakes gamblers felt they were being treated by Las Vegas casinos, but Las Vegas police dismissed this theory and maintained that the motive remains officially undetermined. Investigators also looked into whether a brain abnormality might explain his actions, sending his remains to Stanford University for analysis, but pathologists found no abnormalities. Some psychologists have since pointed to a possible link with alexithymia, a difficulty in identifying and expressing emotions that has appeared in the histories of other mass killers, though this remains speculation rather than an established cause. Because Paddock died by his own hand, there was never an arrest, a trial, or a sentence. The case remains officially closed, with a motive that investigators openly admit may never be known. Number 2, Adam Lanza. On the morning of December 14th, 2012, in the quiet town of Newtown, Connecticut, 20-year-old Adam Lanza shot and killed his mother, Nancy Lanza, inside their own home. He then drove to Sandy Hook Elementary School, a building he had once attended as a child, and within minutes killed 21st grade students and 6 adult staff members before taking his own life as police arrived. Adam Peter Lanza was born on April 22, 1992, in Exeter, New Hampshire, the second son of Peter and Nancy Lanza. The family moved to Newtown when Adam was young. His father later described him as a normal little weird kid who enjoyed Legos and inventing board games, though teachers noticed early on that he needed extra support for speech and social-emotional development. Sandy Hook Elementary, where he attended for over 4 years, had a reputation locally for being accommodating to children with special needs. The transition to middle school proved deeply difficult for Adam. Changing classrooms and navigating noisy hallways overwhelmed him, and his anxiety became so severe that at one point his mother took him to the emergency room. By 8th grade, he was placed on homebound status, meaning he was taught at home rather than in a classroom, reserved for children considered too disabled to attend school even with support. At age 10, he co-authored a book filled with graphic descriptions of violence against children. In 7th grade, an essay he wrote about war was so disturbing that a teacher felt she could not share it with the rest of the class. In high school, Lanza was described as intelligent but nervous and fidgety, someone with no close friends who avoided attention. Despite his struggles, he maintained strong grades, and at 16 he began taking college classes at Western Connecticut State University, while still technically a high school student, earning a diploma through a mix of tutoring, independent study, and college coursework. He briefly attended Norwalk Community College before dropping out after one semester, and briefly worked as an independent contractor at a computer repair shop, where his former employer described him as cordial and professional. His parents divorced in 2009, an outcome described by those close to the family as relatively amicable, and Adam remained living primarily with his mother. In his final years, he became a near-total recluse, taping black trash bags over his bedroom windows to block sunlight, refusing entry to anyone, including his own mother, and communicating with her largely through email despite living under the same roof. He cut off contact entirely with his father and older brother in the 2 years before the shooting. Lanza had been diagnosed at various points with Asperger's syndrome, sensory processing disorder, and obsessive-compulsive disorder, along with depression and anxiety. A short course of medication prescribed at Yale's Child Study Center left him so disoriented that he never took it again, and after that, he received essentially no further psychiatric treatment. A later report from Connecticut's Office of the Child Advocate found that recommendations for extensive support went largely unheeded. By the time of the shooting, he was severely underweight to the point of malnutrition, which medical experts believe likely caused cognitive impairment and heightened his risk of suicide. In his final years, Lanza retreated almost entirely into online spaces, developing an intense, well-documented obsession with mass shootings. He built a massive spreadsheet cataloging details of mass murders going back to the 1700s and maintained accounts on forums dedicated to discussing school shootings, expressing admiration for some past attackers. He also wrote a lengthy essay arguing in favor of normalizing relationships between adults and children, a document investigators described as advocating for what he called pedophiles' rights, though the state's advisory commission found no evidence Lanza had ever acted on this or was himself a victim of abuse. On the morning of the shooting, Lanza destroyed the hard drive of his own computer before leaving the house, making it difficult for investigators to recover much of his digital history. He killed his mother with one of her own legally owned rifles while she slept, then drove to school in her car and shot his way through the glass beside the school's locked front doors. Most of the killing took place in 2 first-grade classrooms near the entrance. Lanza shot himself as police arrived, roughly 10 minutes after the attack began. Because Lanza died at the scene, there was never a trial. Investigators and later state reports concluded he had acted entirely alone, with no evidence anyone else was involved or aware of his plans in advance, aside from an unverified 2008 warning to police that a man believed Lanza was planning to harm his mother and children at the school, a report authorities were unable to substantiate. The state's official investigation, alongside the Office of the Child Advocate, pointed to years of untreated mental illness, extreme isolation, and near-total access to his mother's firearms as contributing factors, while cautioning against drawing a simple line between autism spectrum conditions and violence, since no evidence suggested his diagnosed conditions alone caused what happened. To this day, no single motive has ever been confirmed. Number 3, Nicholas Cruz. On Valentine's Day, February 14th, 2018, a former student walked onto the campus of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, carrying a rifle case. Within about 6 minutes, he had killed 14 students and 3 staff members and wounded 17 others, before slipping away with fleeing students and being arrested roughly an hour and 20 minutes later in a nearby neighborhood. Nicholas Jacob Cruz was born on September 24, 1998, in Margate, Florida, to a mother described as a career criminal who had once been arrested attempting to buy drugs while pregnant with him. He was placed in an orphanage and adopted by Roger and Linda Cruz. Both of his adoptive parents died before he finished high school, leaving him fully orphaned just 3 months before the shooting, after which he lived with relatives and friends. He had been a member of his school's Junior Reserve Officers Training Corps and earned academic recognition there, and was also on the school's varsity air rifle team. Cruz had documented behavioral issues dating back to preschool and was diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and oppositional defiant disorder. He was transferred between schools repeatedly in an effort to manage these problems, and was eventually expelled from Stoneman Douglas in 2017 for disciplinary reasons, after which the school circulated warnings to staff and banned him from wearing a backpack on campus. As early as 2013, psychiatrists had recommended he be involuntarily admitted to a residential treatment facility. In 2016, After he posted on social media about cutting his arms and wanted to buy a gun, a school resource officer recommended an involuntary psychiatric evaluation, but the recommendation was not carried through, and investigators later assessed him as being at low risk of harming himself or others. His online presence painted an increasingly disturbing picture. He posted images with various weapons, and accounts linked to him contained racist and anti-Semitic language, along with comments expressing a desire to kill. In a private group chat, he had written that he thought he was going to kill people, later claiming he was joking. He idolized a number of infamous mass shooters and regularly researched their attacks. In February 2017, he legally purchased an AR-15 style rifle after passing a background check, having already acquired other firearms, including a shotgun. There had been numerous warnings before the shooting. Florida's sheriff's office had received dozens of calls related to Cruz or his family over the preceding decade, including a 2016 tip that he had threatened to shoot up the school, and a 2017 tip describing him as a possible school shooter in the making. In September of 2016, a sheriff's deputy and 2 school counselors all recommended he be committed for mental evaluation. In September 2017, someone using his name posted a YouTube comment saying he was going to be a professional school shooter, a comment reported to the FBI, which was unable to identify the commenter at the time. Then, just over a month before the shooting, the FBI received a specific tip through its public access line describing his gun ownership, his desire to kill people, and the potential of a school shooting, but the agency later admitted this tip was never forwarded to the appropriate local office, as required by protocol. On the day of the attack, Cruz opened fire inside the school before fleeing on foot, blending in with students, and was arrested without incident in Coral Springs. He later told psychologists that he carried out the shooting on Valentine's Day because he believed no one loved him. He was charged the next day with 17 counts of premeditated murder. In March of 2018, a grand jury indicted him on 34 total counts, 17 for murder and 17 for attempted murder, and prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. His defense had offered a guilty plea in exchange for life imprisonment from the start, an offer prosecutors initially refused. The case moved slowly through years of legal proceedings, delayed further by the COVID-19 pandemic. On October 20th, 2021, Cruz pleaded guilty to all charges, expressing remorse and asking the victims' families to decide his fate. His death penalty trial began in July of 2022. Prosecutors presented digital evidence, including disturbing search histories, while the defense presented evidence that Cruz suffered brain damage linked to his birth mother's substance use during pregnancy, along with claims that he had been sexually abused as a child. On October 13, 2022, the jury found that aggravating factors had been proven, but did not unanimously agree that they outweighed mitigating factors, meaning Florida law at the time required a sentence of life imprisonment rather than death. On November 2nd, 2022, Cruz was sentenced to 34 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, one for every person he killed or wounded. Number 4, Salvador Ramos. On May 24th, 2022, 18-year-old Salvador Ramos shot and wounded his grandmother at their home in Uvalde, Texas, then drove her truck to Robb Elementary School, crashed near the building, and entered through a door that failed to lock properly. Over the next hour or more, he killed 19 students and 2 teachers inside 2 connected 4th grade classrooms, while dozens of law enforcement officers waited in the hallway outside rather than moving in. Ramos was born on May 16, 2004, and raised in Uvalde, a small, mostly Hispanic city west of San Antonio. He had attended Robb Elementary as a child, in the very classroom where he would later be killed. He reportedly had a speech difficulty and was ridiculed by other students, and over time became more isolated, missing school and falling behind academically. He eventually stopped attending Uvalde High School altogether after accumulating too many absences to graduate, and worked at a local fast food restaurant. His home life was unstable, marked by a difficult relationship with his mother, after which he moved in with his grandparents. Online, Ramos's behavior grew increasingly alarming. Investigators later found discussions involving violence, weapons, and past attacks, along with disturbing comments some acquaintances noticed, though nothing that reached authorities in a way that prevented what followed. On his 18th birthday, he legally purchased 2 semi-automatic rifles and large quantities of ammunition, since he had no disqualifying criminal history. Photographs of the weapons appeared on his social media in the days before the attack. On the morning of the shooting, following an argument, Ramos seriously wounded his grandmother, who survived and managed to get help from neighbors. Using her phone, he sent messages to a 15-year-old acquaintance in Germany, telling her first that he had shot his grandmother, and then, about 15 minutes before the attack, that he was going to open fire at an elementary school. He crashed her truck near Robb Elementary at 11:28 a.m., fired at two people who approached from a nearby funeral home, then scaled a fence and entered the school through a door a teacher had shut behind her but which failed to lock at approximately 11:33 a.m. What followed became one of the most heavily criticized law enforcement responses in modern American history. Officers arrived within minutes and approached the classroom, but retreated after Ramos fired at them, grazing two of them. The school district's police chief, treated by investigators as the incident commander, made a decision to treat the situation as a barricaded subject rather than an active shooter, a determination the Texas Department of Public Safety later called the wrong decision. Nearly 400 law enforcement officers eventually gathered at the scene, yet no one took clear charge, and officers waited for keys, equipment, and further instruction while children inside the classrooms called 911 repeatedly, pleading for help. Some students who survived by playing dead later told investigators about the sounds and chaos inside the room during that wait. Parents outside the school were restrained, and in some cases handcuffed or pepper sprayed, when they attempted to enter the building themselves. At approximately 12:50 p.m., 77 minutes after Ramos first entered the building, a tactical team, including Border Patrol agents, finally breached the classroom door using a key obtained from a janitor and killed Ramos in the encounter. In total, 19 students and 2 teachers died, and at least 17 other people were physically injured. Because Ramos died at the scene, there was no criminal trial for him personally. Investigators concluded he had acted alone, with no evidence of any accomplice or outside direction. A Texas House of Representatives investigative committee released a report in July of 2022 describing systemic failures across multiple agencies, and in January of 2024, the United States Department of Justice released an extensive critical incident review examining more than 14,000 pieces of evidence and conducting over 260 interviews, concluding that the most significant failure was a decision to stop treating the situation as an active attack, even though officers had sufficient personnel and equipment to move forward far sooner. The school district's police chief was later fired and, along with another former officer, was indicted on charges of child endangerment. One of the 2 officers was acquitted at trial in January of 2026, while the other's case remains unresolved. Robb Elementary was permanently closed and later demolished, with a new school eventually opening in its place. Number 5, James Holmes. Just after midnight on July 20th, 2012, hundreds of moviegoers were settled into a sold-out midnight premiere of Batman film at a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado. A man dressed in protective gear entered through a propped emergency exit, released canisters that filled the room with smoke, and opened fire on the crowd. 12 people were killed and 70 others were injured before the shooter. A 24-year-old former neuroscience graduate student named James Holmes was arrested outside without resistance. Holmes was born on December 13, 1987, in San Diego, California, to a mathematician father and a nurse mother. He grew up largely in a stable household, played sports, and performed exceptionally well academically, graduating high school with honors before earning a bachelor's degree in neuroscience with highest honors from the University of California, Riverside, in 2010. He was accepted into a competitive doctoral program in neuroscience at the University of Colorado's Anschutz Medical Campus, seemingly on track for a promising research career. During his first year in the program, that trajectory began to collapse. Holmes struggled academically and socially, became increasingly isolated, and began seeing university psychiatrist Dr. Lynn Fenton, to whom he described violent thoughts. She grew concerned enough about his homicidal ideation and long-standing fantasies about mass killing that she activated a threat assessment team, though ultimately no involuntary hold was placed on him. In June of 2012, after performing poorly on an important oral examination, Holmes withdrew from the doctoral program. Rather than easing the crisis, Leaving the university seems to have accelerated his planning. During the spring and summer 2012, he legally purchased several firearms, protective equipment, and thousands of rounds of ammunition, all delivered to his apartment or the university. He considered multiple possible attack locations before settling on the movie theater, reasoning that its midnight screening of a hugely anticipated film would draw a large, tightly packed, and mostly adult crowd, since he specifically did not want to kill children. He also spent this time rigging his own apartment with an elaborate collection of homemade explosive and incendiary devices, apparently intended to create a second emergency and draw resources away from the theater. On the night of the attack, Holmes bought a ticket, sat near the front of the theater, then slipped out through an emergency exit partway through the film, propping the door open. He returned to his car, changed into dark protective clothing, including a gas mask and body armor, then re-entered the theater around 12:38 a.m., roughly 20 minutes into the movie. He released smoke canisters and opened fire with multiple weapons before one malfunctioned. Officers arrived within about 90 seconds of being dispatched and found Holmes standing near his car outside. Because of his equipment, one officer briefly wondered if he might be a fellow first responder. He was arrested without a prolonged struggle and warned officers on the spot that his apartment was rigged with explosives, prompting an evacuation of the building while specialists spent hours disabling the devices. Holmes was charged with 165 felony counts, and prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. He entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, and his trial, which began in April 2015, centered almost entirely on the question of his mental state rather than whether he had committed the shooting, which was never seriously disputed. His defense argued he suffered from a severe psychotic illness that left him unable to understand reality. Prosecutors countered that while Holmes was mentally ill, his detailed planning, equipment purchases, and efforts to avoid capture showed he understood what he was doing and knew it was wrong, a position supported by court-appointed psychiatrists who diagnosed him with a serious disorder but found him legally sane. On July 16, 2015, the jury rejected the insanity defense and found Holmes guilty on all counts. During the penalty phase, jurors could not reach the unanimous agreement Colorado law required for a death sentence, and on August 7, 2015, that failure to reach unanimity automatically resulted in a sentence of life imprisonment. On August 26, 2015, Judge Carlos Samar formally sentenced Holmes to 12 consecutive life terms without parole, one for each victim killed, plus an additional 3,318 years for the attempted murder and explosives charges, stating for the record that Holmes should never again set foot in free society. Number 6, Dylann Roof. On the evening of June 17, 2015, a group of parishioners gathered for their regular Wednesday Bible study at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, one of the most historically significant black churches in the country. When a young white stranger walked in, the group welcomed him without hesitation, handing him a Bible and making room for him at the table. He sat with them for about 45 minutes. Then, as the group stood for closing prayer, 21-year-old Dylann Roof opened fire, killing 9 of the people who had just welcomed him as a guest. Roof was born in Columbia, South Carolina, to a father who worked as a carpenter and contractor and a mother who worked as a bartender. His parents divorced and remarried multiple times, and a later legal filing described Roof as exhibiting obsessive behaviors as a child, including a fixation on germs. He attended at least 7 schools across 2 counties, repeated the 9th grade, and eventually stopped attending classes altogether in 2010, claiming he later obtained his equivalency diploma through online schooling. Family members described him spending his time afterward playing video games and using drugs. In the months before the shooting, he had been living between his father's and mother's homes, as well as occasionally staying with an old friend, working briefly as a landscaper before quitting. In the year before the attack, Roof had 2 arrests, both connected to a local shopping mall, once for possessing prescription medication without a valid prescription, and once for violating a ban from property. Neither incident led to significant legal consequences that would have prevented his later gun purchase. According to a friend, Roof had become fixated on the killing of Trayvon Martin and had told people that black people were, in his words, taking over the world, ideas that hardened after he searched online for information related to black-on-white crime and encountered a website run by a group that promotes such material as a political cause. He reportedly told acquaintances of plans to attack a local college, though these statements were not taken seriously at the time, and friends who briefly hid a gun from him after he talked about killing people eventually gave it back. 3 days after the shooting, a website registered under Roof's name was discovered, containing photographs of him posing with symbols associated with white supremacy and an unsigned manifesto explaining his views on race and describing his radicalization as beginning with his research into the Trayvon Martin case. He purchased a firearm used in the attack legally from a store in West Columbia, a purchase later revealed to have gone through only because of a lapse in the FBI's background check system, an error the federal government eventually settled a lawsuit over for $88 million without admitting guilt. Following the shooting, Roof fled and was captured the next morning during a traffic stop in Shelby, North Carolina, roughly 245 miles away, after a driver recognized his car from security footage and alerted police. During interrogation, Roof confessed, stating he hoped the attack would help start a race war, though he expressed some surprise and reportedly felt bad upon learning the actual death toll. Roof became the first person in American history to face the death penalty in both state and federal court simultaneously. In his federal trial, which began in December 2016, he chose to represent himself during the sentencing phase specifically so his attorneys could not introduce evidence of mental illness, which he felt would undermine the racial motive he wanted to preserve as his sole legacy. On December 15, 2016, a federal jury found him guilty on all 33 counts, and on January 11, 2017, he was formally sentenced to death. He later pleaded guilty to the related state charges in April of 2017 to avoid a second death sentence, receiving 9 consecutive life sentences without parole as an additional guarantee that he would never be released even if his federal sentence were ever overturned. His appeals have continued for years, with the federal courts consistently upholding his conviction and sentence, and as of the middle of 2026, further post-conviction proceedings remain active. Roof remains in federal custody on death row. Number 7. Patrick Crusius. On the first Saturday of August, 2019, families were shopping for back-to-school supplies at a crowded Walmart near the Cielo Vista Mall in El Paso, Texas, a border city with a large Hispanic population. A 21-year-old stranger named Patrick Crusius had driven more than 600 miles through the night from his home near Dallas, specifically because of the community he expected to find there. By the time the attack ended, 23 people had lost their lives and 22 others had been wounded in what has been described as one of the deadliest attacks against Latinos in modern American history. Crusius grew up in the Dallas suburb of Allen, Texas, and graduated from Plano Senior High School in 2017 before attending Collin College for about 2 years. People who knew him generally described him as quiet, distant, and socially uncomfortable, someone who spent much of his time on a computer with limited motivation or direction. He was not known to belong to any organized extremist group, but investigators found that he'd spent years consuming racist and anti-immigration material online, gradually adopting a conspiracy theory claiming that Hispanic immigration represented an organized effort to replace the country's white population. In the months before the attack, Crusius obtained a semi-automatic rifle. At one point, his mother contacted police to express concern about whether her son was mature or experienced enough to safely own such a weapon, without identifying him by name, and was told that a legally eligible adult could not be stopped from owning it. No further investigation followed at that time. Late on August 2, 2019, Crusius left his family's home and drove southwest across Texas through the night, a journey of more than 10 hours, specifically choosing El Paso for its large Hispanic population and its proximity to the border with Mexico. Shortly before the attack, a manifesto titled The Inconvenient Truth appeared online on the message board 8chan, which Crusius later admitted to posting. In it, he expressed support for the perpetrator of the Christchurch mosque shootings in New Zealand earlier that year, and described his opposition to what he called a Hispanic invasion, along with concerns about environmental degradation and automation's effect on jobs. He explicitly stated his views predated the presidency of Donald Trump and that Trump should not be blamed for his actions, even though the language closely echoed rhetoric used by the president at the time. At approximately 10:39 that morning, Crusius approached the Walmart carrying his rifle and opened fire, first outside the building and then as he moved through the front section of the store. Employees and a store manager helped direct panicked shoppers toward exits and hiding places. After leaving the store, Crusius drove away. But unlike many mass shooters, he did not attempt suicide or force a violent confrontation with police. A short time later, he encountered law enforcement at an intersection, stopped his vehicle, raised his hands, and surrendered peacefully. He later told investigators he had deliberately targeted people he believed were Mexican. Of the initial victims, 22 people died at or shortly after the scene, and a 23rd victim who had survived with serious injuries died months later, bringing the final death toll to 23. Investigators found no evidence that anyone else was involved in planning or carrying out the attack, though they noted that his ideology had been shaped and reinforced by an online environment where similar conspiracy theories were widely shared and praised. In February of 2020, federal prosecutors filed a 90-count indictment, including hate crime and firearms charges. In January of 2023, the Department of Justice announced it would not seek the death penalty, and on February 8, 2023, Crusius pleaded guilty to all 90 federal charges, receiving 90 consecutive life sentences at July. The state case in Texas remained open for years longer, with prosecutors initially still pursuing the death penalty. Nearly 6 years after the attack, after consulting extensively with victims' families, the new El Paso County District Attorney concluded that most families wanted final resolution rather than more years of hearings and appeals. On April 21, 2025, Crusius pleaded guilty to capital murder and 22 counts of aggravated assault in state court, receiving life without parole plus 22 additional life sentences, closing a legal process that had lasted almost 6 years. Between his federal and state sentences, Crusius has no possibility of parole or release, and the death penalty is no longer being pursued in either jurisdiction. Number 8, Bryan Kohberger. In the early hours of November 13, 2022, four University of Idaho students were stabbed to death inside an off-campus rental home in Moscow, Idaho, a small college town that had not seen a murder in years. For nearly 7 weeks, the case remained unsolved until investigators identified a 28-year-old criminology doctoral student named Bryan Kohberger as their suspect and arrested him at his parents' home in Pennsylvania, more than 2,000 miles away. Bryan Christopher Kohberger was born on November 21, 1994, and grew up in Pennsylvania's Pocono Mountains. He pursued an education heavily focused on psychology and criminal behavior, earning an associate degree in psychology, followed by a bachelor's and then a master's degree in criminal justice from DeSales University. In the summer of 2022, he moved across the country to Pullman, Washington, after being accepted into the criminology doctoral program at Washington State University, where he also worked as a teaching assistant. Pullman sits only a short drive across the state border from Moscow, Idaho, home to the University of Idaho. Classmates described him as intensely interested in criminal behavior and investigative methods, though his social interactions were often uncomfortable, and some students found his manner overly critical. The 4 victims, Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, were university students whose lives were filled with ordinary college routines. Mogen, Goncalves, and Kernodle lived together at a rented house, while Chapin, Kernodle's boyfriend, was staying over that night. On the evening of November 12th, the group had gone out separately, visiting a downtown bar, a food truck, and fraternity house, before all returning home by around 2 a.m. Surveillance cameras capture a white sedan repeatedly driving to the neighborhood in the early hours, passing the house several times before returning at around 4 a.m. One of 2 surviving roommates, who were sleeping on the home's ground floor and were not harmed, later told investigators she had heard sounds in the night and glimpsed a man in dark clothing with distinctive bushy eyebrows walking toward the back of the house before she locked herself in her room. No emergency call was made until nearly noon the next day, when a surviving roommate's phone was used to report an unconscious person in the house. Officers arrived to find that all 4 victims had been killed, stabbed multiple times with what appeared to be a large, fixed blade knife, with no evidence of forced entry and nothing obviously missing from home. Investigators recovered a tan leather knife sheath at the scene, containing a small amount of male DNA on its snap button, though the weapon itself was never found. Detectives reviewed surveillance footage from around the neighborhood, showing the white sedan repeatedly, and asked the public for help identifying certain model years of the vehicle. On November 29th, a university police officer searched school registration records and found a matching white 2015 Hyundai Elantra registered to Bryan Kohberger, who lived less than 10 miles from the victim's home and whose general appearance was consistent with the surviving roommate's description. Investigators obtained his cell phone records, which showed his phone had stopped connecting to the network during the window surrounding the killings before reconnecting south of Moscow as it traveled back toward Pullman. Investigators then used the DNA from the knife sheath while developing him as a suspect, and after he traveled home to Pennsylvania for winter break, surveillance teams collected material from his family's trash that showed a close biological match to the unknown male profile. A direct sample later confirmed the connection. In the early hours of December 30th, 2022, Pennsylvania State Police arrested Kohberger at his parent home. He was extradited to Idaho and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. The case moved slowly through years of pretrial proceedings, with the defense challenging DNA procedures, search warrants, and the intense publicity surrounding the case. And the trial was eventually moved to a different county with jury selection expected in August of 2025. Only weeks before that trial was set to begin, prosecutors offered to remove the death penalty in exchange for a guilty plea to every charge. On July 2nd, 2025, Kohberger pleaded guilty to all charges before Judge Stephen Hippler, admitting to entering the house intending to commit a felony and intentionally killing all 4 students, though he offered no explanation for why. On July 23rd, 2025, he was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for burglary, and declined the opportunity to make any statement to the families gathered in the courtroom. Kohberger's guilty plea largely closed off the possibility of a conventional appeal, but the central question of why he chose a house and those 4 students has never been publicly answered. Number 9, Omar Mateen. Just after 2 a.m. on June 12, 2016, the Music Inside Pulse, a gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida, was interrupted by gunfire. 29-year-old Omar Mateen, an armed security guard who had been investigated by the FBI years earlier but never charged with anything, opened fire on a crowded dance floor, beginning a standoff that would stretch on for more than 3 hours. By the time it ended, 49 people had been killed and dozens more wounded, making it the deadliest mass shooting in American history at the time and the deadliest known attack against LGBT people in the country's history. Omar Mir Sadiq Mateen was born in New York in 1986 to Afghan immigrant parents, and the family moved to Florida when he was young. From an early age, teachers described troubling behavior, including aggression and inappropriate comments about violence and sex. He struggled academically and was moved between schools repeatedly, and classmates recalled him celebrating the September 11 attacks and making disturbing statements to classmates as a teenager. He earned an associate degree in criminal justice and briefly attempted to join Florida's Department of Corrections, but was dismissed from the training program after making an alarming comment about bringing a weapon to class shortly after the Virginia Tech shooting. He then worked for years as a security guard for private firm G4S, eventually being assigned to an unarmed position, and later obtaining credentials needed to carry a firearm on the job. On the surface, Mateen appeared to have a fairly ordinary adult life. He was married twice, had a young son, owned a home, and maintained steady employment. But former co-workers described a much more troubling personality behind that surface, recalling angry outbursts and inflammatory political statements. In 2013, co-workers reported that he had made comments involving terrorist organizations and talked about becoming a martyr, prompting the FBI to open a preliminary investigation. Agents surveilled him, recorded conversations, and interviewed him twice. He admitted making the comments, but claimed he had spoken out of anger after co-workers mocked his religion. After about 10 months, with no evidence he belonged to a terrorist organization or was planning an attack, the inquiry was closed. In 2014, the FBI investigated him again after learning he had a casual connection to a Florida man who had traveled to Syria and died carrying out a suicide bombing for an extremist group, but again found no meaningful evidence connecting Mateen to any plot. In the days before the attack, Mateen legally purchased a semi-automatic rifle and a handgun. Investigators later concluded he had been at least partly radicalized to material he consumed online, following extremist propaganda and expressing admiration for violent actors across different, sometimes contradictory, causes. Pulse was one of Orlando's best-known LGBT nightclubs, and on the night of the attack, it was hosting a themed Latin night that drew a large crowd from the area's Latino and LGBT communities. Mateen entered at approximately 2 a.m. and opened fire. An off-duty police officer working security at the club confronted him almost immediately as additional officers began arriving. Officers eventually forced Mateen into a bathroom area of the club, where he barricaded himself, holding several people hostage, turning what began as an active shooting into a prolonged hostage crisis. During the standoff, Mateen called 911 and pledged allegiance to the leader of the Islamic State, later speaking several times with a police negotiator, describing himself as a soldier and claiming to have explosives, a threat that shaped the entire remainder of the police response even though no explosives were ultimately found. As the threat of possible detonation grew, and after officers created an additional escape route by removing an air conditioning unit from a window, commanders decided on a final breach. At approximately 5:02 a.m., tactical officers used an explosive charge in an armored vehicle to break through an exterior wall, and Mateen was killed in the exchange that followed as he emerged to confront officers. The FBI's investigation, one of the largest in its history, concluded Mateen had acted as a homegrown violent extremist, inspired partly by material he found online, but found no evidence that the Islamic State had directed or was even aware of his plan in advance. Investigators also examined the extent to which hatred toward LGBT people factored into his choice of target, ultimately concluding that his stated motives were a difficult-to-separate mixture of extremism, personal anger, and a desire for recognition. Because Mateen died during the police response, there was no criminal trial for him personally. His wife, Noor Salman, was charged in January of 2017 with aiding him and obstructing the investigation, but federal jury acquitted her of both charges in March of 2018, and no one else was ever convicted in connection with the attack. Number 10. Shawn Grate. In September 2016, a woman being held captive inside a rundown house in Ashland, Ohio, waited until a man holding her fell asleep beside her, then quietly reached for his cell phone and dialed 911, whispering so as not to wake him. That single, nearly 20-minute phone call would not only save her life, it would eventually expose a string of killings across 3 Ohio counties stretching back nearly a decade, all committed by a 40-year-old drifter named Shawn Grate. Shawn Michael Grate was born in Marion, Ohio, on August 8, 1976. He was said to have had a fairly normal early childhood, playing sports and socializing with neighborhood children, though he struggled significantly in school and was held back in both kindergarten and first grade. His parents divorced when he was very young, and when he was 11, his mother left the family to live with a man in Kentucky, an event Grate reportedly resented deeply, harboring what a half-sister later described as murderous fantasies toward her from a young age. He continued living with his father, attending River Valley High School, where he played baseball until an arm injury ended that. A court psychiatrist later described him as a kind of depressed kid despite his outward reputation as a happy teenager, attributing his condition to neglect and emotional detachment during childhood. In 1997, he served time for a felony burglary conviction after breaking into a house with a juvenile accomplice, and was released early after about a year. By 2016, Grate had built an unstable adult life, drifting between temporary housing arrangements and relationships, sometimes staying in abandoned properties without steady employment. To people who met him casually, he could come across as friendly, persuasive, and even protective, despite public records showing prior legal trouble, including that burglary conviction and incidents involving threatening behavior. He regularly visited a Salvation Army community center in Ashland, where meals and social services were available, and it was there that he became friendly with a woman later identified in court only as Jane Doe. Their relationship, involving shared lunches, walks, and conversations about religion, was entirely platonic on her part, something she made clear by maintaining firm boundaries, but Grate appears to have interpreted the friendship very differently. On September 11, 2016, Grate persuaded the woman to accompany him to a vacant house on Covert Court, claiming he had belongings there she could use. Once inside, he prevented her from leaving, holding her captive for approximately 2 days, restricting her movements and controlling her closely inside the cluttered, largely abandoned-looking building. During the early morning hours of September 13th, Grate fell asleep and the woman was able to partially free herself, reach his phone, and call for help at approximately 6:48 a.m. Unable to get an exact address, she described a yellow house near a laundromat with an identical building standing beside it, and a dispatcher carefully guided officers who approached without sirens to avoid alerting Grate to the correct building after some tense confusion between the two nearly identical houses. Officers entered and rescued the woman, arresting Grate inside without incident. What began as a kidnapping case immediately became something much larger. As officers examined the property, they discovered the remains of two women inside the house: Elizabeth Griffith, a 29-year-old Ashland resident who had been missing for about a month, and Stacy Stanley, also known as Stacy Hicks, a 43-year-old woman who had been reported missing shortly before Grate's arrest. Over the course of roughly 33 hours of questioning spread across 8 days, Grate gradually revealed more, eventually directing investigators to the remains of Candace Cunningham, a woman he had maintained an unstable on and off relationship with, found behind a fire-damaged property in neighboring Richland County. He also described the death of Rebecca Leacy, whose 2015 death had originally been ruled an accidental overdose, prompting investigators to reopen that case. He then described an older killing in Marion County, connecting himself to the death of a woman whose remains had been found beside a road back in 2007 and who had remained unidentified for over a decade, later confirmed through advanced genetic research in 2019 to be Dana Nicole Lowry, a 23-year-old mother from Louisiana who had been traveling while selling magazine subscriptions at the time of her death. In September of 2016, an Ashland County grand jury indicted Grate on 23 felony counts covering the two Ashland murders and the kidnapping and repeated sexual assault of the surviving woman, and prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. Jury selection began in April of 2018, and during the trial, Grate pleaded guilty to 15 of the 23 charges, leaving the jury to decide the remaining 8, including the most serious murder charges. On May 7, 2018, the jury found him guilty on all remaining counts, and after a penalty phase weighing his troubled background against the deliberate, repeated nature of his crimes, jurors recommended death sentences for the killings of Griffith and Stanley. On June 1, 2018, Judge Ronald Forsyth followed that recommendation and formally sentenced Grate to death, along with additional prison terms for his other convictions. The legal process did not end there. On March 1, 2019, Grate pleaded guilty in Richland County to the killings of Rebecca Leacy and Candace Cunningham, receiving life without parole for one case and an additional term of 17 years to life for the other to run consecutively. 6 months later, on September 11, 2019, he pleaded guilty in Marion County to killing Dana Lowry, receiving another sentence of life without parole plus 16 additional years. In total, Grate was ultimately convicted in connection with the deaths of 5 women. His automatic appeal reached the Ohio Supreme Court, which unanimously upheld both his aggravated murder convictions and his death sentence in December of 2020, and further legal challenges, including an extensive federal petition filed in 2025 raising 18 separate claims about the fairness of his trial, have so far failed to change his convictions or sentence.